Just 3 months to go for the Lok Sabha elections and politicians are going all out to attract rural voters. Rahul Gandhi has promised a minimum income guarantee for the poor if voted to power. Many believe this is a preemptive strike as the government is also working on an income scheme of its own. Meanwhile, the former Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian has proposed an income support scheme called the Quasi-Universal Basic Rural Income. The scheme proposes to transfer 18,000 rupees per year to each rural household. Arvind Subramanian has pegged the cost of this scheme at 1.3% of GDP with a total outlay of 2.64 lakh crore rupees. Now, according to his proposal, the centre and states will jointly finance the scheme in a 50-50 model. He also proposes scrapping of other farm subsidies to save money for the income scheme. The big questions: will this scheme be fiscally prudent? Will all states come on board? And will it be correct to eliminate existing farm subsidies, or will there be political will, in fact, to do so? Joining us now is the man himself, Arvind Subramanian. Mr. Subramanian, thanks very much for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. This was an idea that you first proposed in the economic survey in 2016-17. It didn't find much traction then, but it certainly seems to have found traction now. The Congress party has adapted your idea of a universal basic income and has suggested a minimum income guarantee for the poorest of poor households. You are now suggesting a quasi-universal basic rural income to address 75% of the rural population. So you do agree that the earlier idea of a universal basic income, which was universal and unconditional in your own words, cannot work in India?
Well, first of all, I think that, while we first proposed the idea in, February 2017, I think it's fairer to say that it's kind of been very much part of the policy discussions. And then, it's been discussed by Jammu and Kashmir first. But also, I think schemes like Raitu Bandhu and Kalia are in the spirit of a universal basic income. All right. Now, what we have proposed, most recently, this quasi-universal basic rural income is just a kind of acknowledgement that the political opportunity for this has been created by the agrarian distress. So, policies don't just get made in a vacuum. You need some kind of conditions for it to come about. And, agricultural distress seems to have provided the political opportunity. And that's why we saw Raitu Bandhu and then Kalia being enacted. So what, and of course, loan waivers as well. So what we're saying now is that let's begin with a version of universal basic income. Let's apply it to rural India because that's where the distress is most acute. And let's try and do better than existing schemes that are trying to address a similar problem. So as we said, loan waivers, Raitu Bandhu, Kalia, loan waivers and Raitu Bandhu especially are highly regressive. They only benefit the very rich farmers because only the very rich can borrow from official sources or only the very rich have land. Let's kind of do this in rural India, but do it in a way where implementation would be much simpler. Kalia, for example, also I think is administratively very difficult to implement because you have to identify landed farmers, tenants, laborers. It's kind of almost like an administrative nightmare. So what we're saying is that take that principle, extend it to almost all rural households, and do it based not on targeting in beneficiaries, which has been, the bane of anti-poverty programs in India. It's so difficult to target. Instead, exclude out, at some cutoff, who you think may not deserve this as much. Okay. And that's how you get a quasi-universal basic rural income. Now, I think what the Congress has done is, kind of said it's a minimum income guarantee for the poor. Now, I don't know the scheme in all its details, but I think that it kind of doesn't quite embrace the universality idea because it still talks about the poor, identifying the poor, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that conceptually, it's not yet in the realms of a universal basic income.
Well, that's right, because Mr. Chidambaram, while he was speaking with me, said that their idea is an adaptation of the idea for universal basic income because they are targeting only the poorest of the poor households, which is why they also believe that the cost of the exchequer will be much lower than what you are estimating. But let's talk about the cost, because I think that is what most people are worried about. Can India afford, whether it's a minimum guarantee income scheme or a quasi-universal basic income scheme? You're saying that we can, and you argued in the economic survey that the emancipatory value of basic income is several times greater than its monetary value. If you can break up the numbers for us and answer the basic question on whether we can afford this or not.
So at least in the version that we've recently proposed, we estimate the cost at about 1.3% of GDP. And I think the way we've kind of developed the proposal, the idea in the survey, based on discussions with then Finance Minister Hasib Drabu, is that to do it in a cooperative federalism framework. That I think that for all its deficiencies, I mean GST showed that the way forward for India is cooperative federalism. And in this too, I think the center and the states need to come together, both to find the resources and to implement it. So in our scheme of things, 1.3% of GDP, it's about 18,000 per year per household. The way it would work, as I envisage, is that 1/3 of that, 6,000 rupees, would be given unconditionally by the center. And then the other 3,000, which would make up half the 18,000, would be take the form of telling the state governments, look, we give you money for centrally sponsored schemes. We will untie those and you can use it in order to finance a universal basic income. Now, let's do the arithmetic.
Okay. The
6,000 that the center would provide, we estimated it about 84,000 crores, I think, in 2019-20 rupees. And then you see, remember that this is an alternative to other agricultural programs like loan waivers, etc. So we identified, 4 or 5, eminent candidates, interest rate loans, the extra MSP, maybe even aspects of Fasal Bima Yojana which don't work very well, and of course the fertilizer subsidy. So if you put all these together, I think you can come up with something like the amounts that are necessary. The thing is that I do believe that at this stage we should not add to the fiscal deficit either at the center or the states.
Yeah.
And also I think we should find, permanent financing, not one-off financing like RBI resources. But I think if you look at the agricultural budget, of course it will require political will, but I think the resources are there to finance, the initial 84,000 that the government, we envisage, the central government should provide.
Okay, so a couple of things that you're saying there. You believe that this should be 50-50 almost between the centre and the states, and that the states should have skin in the game, which is something that I discussed with Mr. Chidambaram as well. But he did say that initially they envisaged this as largely a centrally sponsored scheme. 84,000 crores to start with, that is your estimation. But, you talked about the fact that the government should not dip into the Reserve Bank's reserves to be able to fund this. But in an election year, if this were to be an announcement that the government makes in the budget, I mean, it will have to be an add-on. There can be no political case at this point in time to do away with the current subsidies, whether it's fertilizer or any others that you've already articulated. So is that a concern that we might see this being an add-on, not just now, but even in the future? And then what does it do to the fisc?
Yeah, I think you make an important distinction between whatever is going to be announced. Announcements are related, obviously, to politics, and these announcements might happen however they happen. But the point is, they will be implemented, after the next election, and regardless of which government is in power at that stage, you have to go back to the fiscal drawing board and have a hard look at the resources. So at the time of implementation, after the elections, I think governments will have to face up to having to finance this largely through existing resources. I mean, otherwise, the fiscal arithmetic can get difficult both for the center and the state governments. I don't think we have a lot of extra fiscal space, at either level. So whatever happens now, announcements, etc., let's all, that'll happen. But I think let's look through that and see how exactly when the rubber hits the road in terms of implementation, how that will be financed.
You talked about permanent sources of financing. Where could the government look to raise the additional revenues to finance a scheme like this?
No,
what would the ideas be there?
No, I think that it will have to come from existing resources. The whole agricultural budget will have to be looked at. The fertilizer subsidy will have to be looked at. And then going forward, when the serious arithmetic is done, whenever implementation time comes, we may have to see if existing expenditures hopefully will be enough to be pruned. If not, we may have to think of whatever additional taxes. But that's something that whatever next government comes into power will have to look at that very carefully, because I don't think we should be increasing the budget deficit to finance something like that. I mean, it's a permanent entitlement, so therefore, you can't permanently increase the budget deficit by 1.5% of GDP or whatever it's going to cost. So it has to be based mostly on expenditure rationalization. And I do believe it will be politically difficult. But take something like interest rate subsidies on crop loans. I really, wonder who benefits from this. I think, there's a lot of research which shows that priority sector lending to agriculture, doesn't end up in agriculture at all. There's a paper by the RBI written a few years ago. So I think there is scope for finding expenditure pruning from within the existing budget, existing expenditure envelope in agriculture.
So the onus will have to be on expenditure rationalization, especially within the agriculture budget, to be able to provide for what will be an entitlement, a permanent entitlement, if it in fact does go through. But let me talk to you about the risks, and that's the question that I asked, that do the risks outweigh the rewards, though you certainly believe that the rewards outweigh the risks. But, you had articulated several risks in the economic survey as the arguments against a universal basic income. And largely, and that's the sort of feedback that you get on social media, that this is going to be a disincentive to work, that this is going to make people lazy, and what does it do to the honest taxpayer? Why should the honest taxpayer be paying for this? How do you respond to that criticism and that argument?
Yeah, so I think there are a whole series of arguments. One, of course, is the work thing. There, I think a lot of the evidence shows that at those levels of basic income, it's not at all likely that people will stop working. I think that's not a very serious thing. I think the whole thing about should the taxpayer pay, etc. Remember that the taxpayer is already having to pay by way of other measures that are being taken, loan waivers, Raitu Bandhu, Kalya. I mean, if always saying at this stages, there are better ways of achieving that than what. So it's not as if the political process is not, doing this. So the taxpayer in some ways is on the hook. The question is, what is the best way of doing it at this stage with all its, kind of enormous benefits? Remember, the rural economy has suffered quite a bit, and therefore this would actually, perk up the rural economy. And Harish Damodaran has been saying that, the rural economy is depressed, and he thinks that this kind of thing could really serve to prop up prices, raise farmer incomes, just improve the rural economy more broadly. So I think, and so it's not costless, there are trade-offs, but I think the trade-offs have to be assessed not as, a whole new program being implemented, but a program that should A, substitute for other measures being considered and being financed by things that are in the expenditure envelope that are actually, not that effective or efficient. I mean, you take the fertilizer subsidy, for example, right? I mean, let's not even begin to go into the costs of that, the environmental cost, the water table cost, the health costs. So I think, on balance, I think this would be the right thing to do. I need to go.
Okay, you believe that this is the. One quick final question. You believe that this is the right thing to do, this is the right time. You know, just before you left India, as you were signing off as Chief Economic Advisor, I asked you if there was the one thing that surprised you, and you said that it was what had happened to the agriculture sector, to the agri-economy, and you said that you were perplexed by the kind of collapse that we had seen there. What would you attribute that to, and do you believe that there has almost been a denial, a benign neglect almost on the part of the government to be able to address that?
Well, I think that it's, for me, I still don't fully understand it, because remember that this collapse in prices has happened amidst good agricultural production. So while we had expected prices to come down a little bit, but we didn't expect it to do, prices to kind of really sink so much. So I think it's something we need to understand. But at this stage, I think we have to find ways to respond to it. And that's where the Quasi-Universal Basic Rural Income idea comes in.
So I'll end by asking you, you believe that this is an idea whose time has come, Mr. Subramanian?
I think so. I very much think so. Some variation of the idea, I think the time has come. And you can see that in all the, the Sikkim is doing it, Telangana, Chhattisgarh, now the Congress manifesto. I don't know what's going to be in the budget, but I think it's not just my saying that the idea whose time has come. I think it's being manifested in what various agents in the political spectrum are saying as well, and doing or planning.
Well, Mr. Subramanian, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. That's Arvind Subramanian, brought forth the idea of a universal basic income scheme in the economic survey in 2017, and now has adapted that idea and put forward the quasi-universal basic income idea. The Congress party has already promised, as part of its promise for the elections, a minimum income guarantee scheme to rural households, which is what the former Chief Economic Advisor is also suggesting, an idea he believes whose time has come. We'll take a break. There's a lot more coming up, but before we go, here's the former Finance Minister P. Chidambaram on the Congress's idea of a minimum guarantee income scheme.
We are adapting the idea of universal basic income to our situation and to our needs. It will be through a transfer of money to families, the poorest families of India. I think it's doable within our, consistent with the fiscal situation. Calculations have been made. Dr. Arvind Subramanian, for example, has calculated a UBI to be 1.5% of GDP. But given our goal, namely that the poorest in India will be brought up to a level of minimum income, you will agree with me, it will be much less than the calculations made by Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Obviously, we'll invite all the states to join in this effort, and I believe no state will say no. And I'm sure we'll find ways in which the obligation can be shared. But the initiative will be from the central government, and the bulk of the obligation will be borne by the central government.